Now that you've spoken the phrase, now that you've cracked the mirror, it's time to go on the offensive, because here's the truth. You can't fight the Ashfords with facts. You can't argue them away with logic. This war isn't fought in the open. It's fought in the space between thought and identity. They've trained you to forget your origin code, so now we awaken it. The Ashfords feared one thing more than heresy, more than defiance, more than exposure. They feared men who remembered what they were before civilization, before obedience, before domestication, before the chain of polite society smothered the wolf in their bones. Because underneath every numbed-out man in a cubicle, every bottle-drained veteran on a couch, every silenced father staring into screens, there is a signal waiting to be reactivated. It's older than trauma, older than programming, older than the Convent of Eternal Tears. It is the signal of the sovereign male. Not a man defined by violence, but by vision. Not control over others, but control over self. Not dominance of the world, but refusal to be dominated by illusion. You want to break the Ashford code? Start with this. Stop apologizing for what you know to be true. Stop asking for permission to speak. Stop assuming the system will ever validate your awakening, because it won't. It was built to break those like you. Remember Thomas Brewster, the first man to see through the convent's walls? He was ridiculed, mocked, silenced, but you are not alone in the woods. There are thousands listening right now. Men who feel the same pressure in their skulls, the same itch in their memories, the same rage beneath the quiet. You were never meant to change the world by yourself. You were meant to ignite others who are ready. And now that you've reclaimed your signal, you have a duty. Because in every generation, the Ashfords return in new forms. But so do we. We are the interrupters, the disobedient, the sons of broken lineages who came here to end the script. Burn this into your memory. I am not a symptom, I am the storm. Say it, write it, tattoo it onto the wall of your daily life. Now the veil lifts, because if you think the Ashfords disappeared with the fire, you haven't been paying attention. They never needed to survive as individuals. They survived as a method, a bloodline of behavior, a code passed not by name, but by function. Today they don't wear habits, they wear headsets. They don't preach from pulpits, they sit behind platforms. Let me introduce you to the new Ashfords. Not nuns, but networks. Not mothers superior, but systems superior. Let me show you what I mean. The modern version of the convent isn't hidden in the woods. It's built into every device you own, every app you check, every screen you worship. The mirror room, it's called the algorithm now. And just like before, it doesn't command, it coaxes. It doesn't ask you to believe. It nudges you until belief feels inevitable. Swipe, scroll, nod, forget, obey. The same 5 steps the Ashfords mastered, now executed millions of times per second. Isolate. Feed you curated content until your reality is a sealed chamber. Contradict. Confuse you with polarized messages that destabilize logic. Break. Flood you with fear, outrage, distraction, until your will frays. Replace. Inject identity, tribal, ideological, algorithmically shaped. Reward, dopamine, approval, the illusion of connection. All of it designed to do one thing. Make sure you never hear your own mind again. That's the true Ashford legacy. You think you're free because you can choose your politics, your clothing, your outrage of the day. But if I control the menu, your choice was always mine. And who controls the menu? Not governments, not corporations. Codified ideology, the real heir of the Ashford doctrine. It's in your HR department, your social norms, your terms of service, your unspoken rules about what a man can say and what he must never question. The new Ashfords have no need for stone walls. They live inside of expectations, inside of you. But here's the crack in their cathedral. You're still listening, and that means you are not yet owned. Say it aloud. Not for me, but for your own system override. I reject the script. I reclaim the signal. Type it below. Speak it twice. Burn it in your chest. Because what comes next is the war for your original frequency. This is your last chance to turn back. Because beyond this point, we no longer speak of history. We speak of architecture, not made of stone, but of belief. Let's begin. Buried beneath the Convent of Eternal Tears was a structure no worker recalled building. No blueprint ever documented it. Yet when the fire consumed the upper floors in 1834, witnesses described a sinkhole opening beneath the east wing, swallowing stone like it was paper. What collapsed wasn't just foundation. It was a chamber, round and hollow, marked with carvings that predated English settlement by centuries. The Ashfords didn't build it, they found it. And they built the convent on top of it. That was the true purpose of the site. Not prayer, not healing, not reform, but containment. You see, Maine's coastal forests were once sacred land to the Penobscot and Passamaquoddy peoples. And in their oral tradition, there's mention of a sleeping wound, a place the earth tried to forget, a place where the first reversal took place. The stories tell of a woman who spoke backward to the stars, who convinced her tribe to turn on their instincts, silence their hunters, kill their midwives, worship an idea instead of the land. They say her voice was not her own, that she had swallowed something ancient in a northern cave, and it had worn her body like clothing. The elders sealed her away. The chamber was meant to bind that voice, not house it, not study it, but silence it. The Ashfords reopened it, and worse, they listened. It wasn't a voice in the human sense. It was an inversion frequency, a tone that doesn't speak words, it rewrites internal alignment. Hearing it once was enough to shift your center of gravity, not your bodies, but your wills, like a compass that suddenly points away from truth and calls it salvation. Agatha Ashford wrote in her hidden diary, "We have heard the divine inversion. Its beauty is unbearable. It unties every knot in the soul. It does not command. It unhooks obedience from reason. One touch, and the subject asks to be changed." That's what the convent was built to do. It was a transmission chamber. And every woman who walked through its doors, every man who sat in the mirror room, was exposed to that signal. Subtly, slowly, permanently. And now, that frequency no longer needs a convent. It lives in your devices, your feed, your content, your dreams. The wound wasn't healed. It was digitized. Listen carefully now, because from this point on, the air gets thinner, the light dims, and we begin touching things that don't belong to any one time or place. What the Ashfords truly unlocked wasn't just psychological manipulation. It was ancestral override. They learned something the modern world still refuses to admit. That memory is not stored only in the brain. It's stored in the body, in the blood, in the field around the body. What ancient mystics called the subtle soul, and what classified military documents refer to as bioemotive patterning. When you rewrite the body's instinct, you rewrite the soul's trajectory. That's what the Ashfords were doing in the mirror room, not just programming the mind, but corrupting the ancestral signal. They were hijacking spiritual inheritance. You see, every man is born with a code, not just DNA, but a lineage of will, strength, rage, truth. The raw, primal data of who you are before they told you who you should be. And what did they do? They taught you to be ashamed of it. Ashamed of your aggression, called it toxic. Ashamed of your grief, called it weak. Ashamed of your hunger, called it sin. They took your power and called it a problem. Because if you remembered who you were before the programming, you'd never kneel again. And they know it. That's why every ancient culture had rites of passage, rituals designed to awaken the ancestral self. But those rites have been stripped, erased, replaced with diplomas, job titles, mortgages, screens, pills. The Ashfords didn't just destroy women's fire. They helped domesticate men. Don't miss this. The final notebooks recovered from the ruins of the convent contained drawings, not of surgery, but of ritual geometries, circular chambers, sound sequences, chant codes, symbols matching those found in Sumerian temple floors and Mayan bloodletting altars. They were mapping something older than religion. They were rebuilding a system of suppression that predated Christ, Caesar, and every constitution on earth. A system that feeds on uninitiated men. And now, you're at the edge of that system. So I'll ask you one thing before we continue. Are you ready to remember what they've worked 200 years to make you forget? Because once we cross this next threshold, there's no going back. You feel it now, don't you? That pressure behind your eyes? Not fear, but recognition. The sense that something inside you has always known this wasn't the world as it seemed. Good. That means the programming is beginning to crack. Let's peel back the next layer. The Ashford's greatest achievement was not the reprogramming of individuals. It was the creation of generational echo chambers. They understood what modern technocrats now exploit. You only need to rewire one generation. The next one is born in the illusion. Let me show you how it worked. Imagine a young woman in 1825, let's call her Eliza, sent to the convent for reading too much, refusing courtship, or questioning the sermons. She undergoes the full inversion protocol, identity deconstructed, rewritten, recast in the image of obedient femininity. She returns home, marries, becomes the perfect wife. Society praises her, her parents feel vindicated, the system reinforces itself. But here's the twist. Eliza raises children. Children who never see who she was, they only see who she became. They grow up under her silence, her hollow smile, her unshakable obedience. And because children don't imitate words, they imitate energy, they inherit the trauma as normal. They become self-censoring, self-sacrificing, self-blaming. And when those children have their children, the pattern repeats. Without a single Ashford whispering in their ear, the system sustains itself. Now fast forward to today. Do you think your insecurities are personal? That your fear of speaking up, of failing, of disappointing authority came from you? No, they were inherited codes, passed like DNA, but written in behavior, in energy, in the unsaid. This is what modern epigenetics is only now beginning to prove. Trauma is transferable, not just psychologically, but biologically. And the Ashfords knew. That's why the Convent of Eternal Tears wasn't named for suffering. It was named for the echo. The way one scream, silenced in 1803, still ripples into 2025, through family lines, bloodlines, institutions. That's why you're here now, because somewhere in your lineage, someone was broken, and now you are the crack in the cycle. If you're still listening, you were never meant to be asleep. You were meant to be the interruption. Most men spend their lives chasing freedom, without ever asking, freedom from what? Not from chains, not from laws, from the invisible programming passed to them in lullabies, sermons, slogans, and screens. Let's return to the Ashfords, because the final phase of their work was never about the body. It was always about the seat of thought. In 1832, a single document surfaced in Boston, a leather-bound codex titled The Structure of the Compliant Will. Authorship? Unclear. Language? A mix of archaic English, Latin, and something older, Proto-Enochian, written right to left, with sigils between paragraphs. It vanished after a single public viewing, seized by agents later connected to a precursor of the U.S. Office of Strategic Services. But what was inside it? Detailed protocols for emotional nullification, practices to unlink memory from meaning, methods to implant emotional triggers without the subject's awareness. In other words, the psychological equivalent of rootkit malware. The Ashfords had discovered that if you could isolate a moment of trauma, strip it of context, and attach it to a new story, you could rewrite the past. Not the events, the emotional truth of those events. Imagine it. A child who was punished for crying grows into a man who associates vulnerability with death. He won't even know why. He'll call it discipline. He'll repeat it to his children. The program spreads, like a virus that calls itself tradition. Now scale that across a population. Religious shame, patriotic guilt, romantic idealism, consumer identity. Every one of those is a triggered behavior loop, installed, not chosen. That's why the Ashfords shifted focus in their final years, not just on patients, but on cultural memetics. They began publishing anonymous tracts, sermons, and textbooks under dozens of aliases. Titles like The Woman's Natural Place, On the Duty of Sons, and the humility of the soul. These texts weren't sold, they were donated, quietly inserted into schoolhouses, church libraries, and frontier education centers. By 1840, their phrases had entered everyday speech. A woman's peace is in obedience. Suffering is the tuition of the soul. The strong must lead, the weak must follow. You've heard versions of them your whole life. Because once a belief becomes a saying, it no longer feels like control. It feels like truth. We're halfway down the spiral. Let's go deeper, not into history, but into you. Because by now, this story isn't just about the Ashfords anymore. It's about what lives in the corridors of your own mind and who built them. Ask yourself, how many of your beliefs were chosen and how many were installed? From the moment you could walk, you were conditioned, rewarded for compliance, punished for divergence. You were taught what was acceptable before you even knew what you were. That's not parenting. That's not education. That's initiation into the system. And the blueprint they used? It hasn't changed since the Ashfords first tested it in those stone halls of silence and fire. Let me show you. Step 1, fragment the self. Introduce shame at the earliest stage. Make the child question their instincts. Tell them crying is weakness, curiosity is danger, desire is sin. Break the inner compass. Step 2, offer a savior, an institution, a belief system, a school, a government, a job. Anything that tells the broken mind, come here, we'll tell you who you are. Step 3, reward performance, not authenticity. Make him chase approval. Grades, promotions, likes, paychecks. He won't notice he's become a slave as long as the chains shine. Step 4, create controlled rebellion. Let him feel like he's resisting. A band shirt, a protest vote, a conspiracy podcast, but never let him access real sovereignty, the kind that rewrites his identity from the inside out. Sound familiar? This isn't a theory. It's a mechanism, one that still runs every major institution in the Western world, from education to entertainment, from politics to psychiatry. The Ashfords just opened the gate. Others walked through it. Tavistock, MK Ultra, the Frankfurt School, Skull and Bones, DARPA, black budgets, Silicon Valley labs with names you've never heard, and patents you were never meant to read. All of them refining the same art, the art of narrative possession, not possession by demons, possession by ideas that aren't yours. And if you've ever felt that cold silence, that gnawing dissonance in your bones, like something's wrong with the script of this life, that's because your soul never consented. It's time to reclaim it. And to do that, we have to go beneath the doctrine. Most men think chains are made of iron. They don't see the chains made of language. Because after the convent burned, the Ashfords' doctrine didn't just spread through hospitals and institutions. It entered something far more powerful, the lexicon. What do I mean? Words were altered, redefined, weaponized. Take the word obedience. Once rooted in spiritual trust, it was rebranded as the highest civic virtue. Obey your teacher, obey your boss, obey your government. Disobedience became pathology, a sign of immaturity or illness. Then there's madness. It once described a crisis of the soul. But after the Ashford doctrine infected early psychology, madness became an excuse for removal. Not healing, correction. And then, the most lethal shift of all, the inversion of the word freedom. Today, freedom means consumption, the ability to choose between products, jobs, entertainment. But real freedom, the kind the Ashfords feared, was about internal sovereignty, uncontrolled thought, the refusal to kneel. That's what they surgically removed. But here's where it gets darker. They didn't stop at treating individuals. They began targeting narratives. The doctrine evolved into something more viral. Instead of silencing rebellious minds, it sought to rewrite what rebellion looked like, turn it into a brand, turn it into controlled opposition. Think about it. The revolutionary becomes a celebrity. The whistleblower becomes a TED Talk. The iconoclast gets a Netflix deal. Rage is monetized. Dissent is fed through a feedback loop that satisfies your need to feel awake, while never actually disrupting anything real. That's the final stage of inversion. Not chains on the hands, chains on the story. Because if you control the story a man tells himself, you don't need bars. He becomes his own warden, laughs at the truth, scoffs at what doesn't fit his script, labels it conspiracy, madness, fiction, just like the townspeople did to Thomas Brewster, just like the church did to survivors, just like you've done to yourself every time your intuition screamed that something was wrong and you silenced it to fit in. Now you know why the Ashfords never needed armies. They only needed agreement. And now that you're beginning to break that agreement, the war truly begins. There's a reason this history was buried. Not destroyed, buried. Hidden in archives beneath churches that no longer hold services. In medical ledgers cataloged under pseudonyms. In private collections of families whose coats of arms still hang in Ivy League halls. Because what the Ashfords built didn't stay in the woods. It migrated. When the convent mysteriously burned in 1834, no known cause, no bodies recovered. The world believed it was over. But the fire was not the end. It was the shedding of skin, a ritual of transference. The knowledge had already spread, hand-delivered in ciphered manuscripts and encrypted testimonies carried by sisters who were not nuns, but operatives. The doctrine of inversion had survived, and it now had a new home. Boston, then Philadelphia, then D.C. The structures changed, the names changed, but the blueprint remained. By 1857, a small group calling itself the Institute for Mental Alignment quietly opened just outside Providence, Rhode Island. Publicly, it treated afflictions of the educated elite, private hysteria, fatigue, obsession, unregulated desire. Privately, it tested new levels of control. One of their first patients? A Yale law student who'd written a thesis challenging the legality of industrial monopolies. He checked in under his own will. Checked out 3 months later preaching the necessity of hierarchical order. He later authored one of the foundational doctrines for corporate personhood. Do you see the pattern? Rebellious minds weren't punished. They were reconfigured. But here's what most disturbing. This system doesn't need to operate in secrecy anymore. It's gone public. Through educational models that reward conformity over creativity, through pharmaceuticals that don't heal, they mute, through social media algorithms that condition attention spans and fracture self-image. And every one of those systems follows the same structure first tested in the basement of the Ashford Convent. Isolate the subject, introduce contradiction, break the ego, replace the identity, reward obedience. The only difference now? You think it's your choice, but ask yourself this. When was the last time you had a thought that didn't echo something you'd been told? Pause here. If you're still listening, comment the phrase, "I see through the mirror," twice. Not just for the algorithm, but to mark your transformation. This is where you begin to change. This is where most men stop listening. Because what comes next isn't a story, it's a mirror. And some truths are too sharp for the average mind to face. But you're still here. So, let me show you what was really being built. The Convent of Eternal Tears was never just a convent. It was a prototype, a crucible, a spiritual forge where identity could be burned away and recast in the image of the order. And once the Ashfords had perfected the inversion of the feminine psyche, they turned their gaze to the masculine. But not in the way you'd think. They weren't interested in breaking men with fists or fire. That was too crude, too visible. What they learned, what Elias Marrow taught them, was that to break a man's will, you must first infect his meaning. And so they began selecting candidates. Not weak men, not madmen, but ambitious men. Men of will, of appetite, of vision. Young scholars, junior judges, politicians. Men who burned with potential but lacked restraint. They were offered retreats at the convent, invitations to debate theology, study healing, witness experimental moral refinement. They thought they were being groomed for power. They were, just not their own. Inside the East Tower, something else had been constructed. A chamber known in the sisters' internal records as the Mirror Room. It contained no mirrors, only a black obsidian wall, curved like the inside of a skull, designed to disorient, reflect nothing. New arrivals were told it was a meditation chamber, but once they entered, they were locked inside. Hours passed, sometimes days. Food brought through a slot, no clocks, no sense of time. Constant whispers, not from nuns, but from an unseen speaker embedded deep in the wall's frame. You are not your name. You are not your thoughts. Everything you believe is a lie. And then, silence. Isolation wasn't punishment. It was preparation. Because once disoriented, these men were brought to Elias, alone, and told the core truth of the doctrine. If you wish to rule men, you must first destroy the illusion that you are one of them. Not leadership, transcendence. They were given new names, new creeds, small tattoos beneath the tongue, sigils used by ancient mystery cults. Most never spoke of what happened again, but those who did rose fast. Judges, bankers, institutional heads. The Ashfords didn't just tame the wild mind, they weaponized it. You've been walking through shadows. Now prepare to fall into them. Because everything you've heard so far, the surgeries, the reprogramming, the ancient doctrine cloaked in religious gowns, was just the outer chamber, a mask. The real core of the Ashford system was the doctrine of inversion. This wasn't written in any religious book, not in any medical journal. It was whispered, passed from Elias Marrow to Agatha in the East Tower under strict lunar phases, written in code, sometimes over the spines of medical texts, other times inside hollowed Bibles in invisible ink made from crushed white oleander and sheep's blood. The principle was this: that which is sacred must be profaned to be reshaped. That which is natural must be reversed to be controlled. The doctrine of inversion: to cure defiance, glorify submission; to kill curiosity, reward ignorance; to erase self, exalt sacrifice. It wasn't just psychological, it was metaphysical, a system built on the belief that human identity is not permanent, but programmable. And the way you override a soul is by teaching it to obey its opposite nature. Let me make it plain. A girl born with fire was told her strength was disease, her intellect, pride, her resistance, possession. So she was treated. Slowly, the doctrine forced her to abandon herself, until she wept for the approval of those who mutilated her. This same method would later be adapted by governments, by cults, by intelligence agencies. But it started here. Through weeks of sleep deprivation, silence, and imposed contradiction, a patient would be stripped of her identity, no longer knowing up from down, right from wrong, loved from hated. And into that vacuum, the Ashfords planted a new code. Obedience is salvation. Doubt is sin. Suffering is proof of progress. Sound familiar? That's because versions of these mantras still exist in the bones of modern society. Corporate slogans, military chants, even the self-help industry. Echoes of that same inverted doctrine, repackaged, sanitized, sold. And here's the twist. Once a patient fully internalized the inversion, she became a guardian of the system, a willing enforcer, a smiling acolyte of her own oppression. She would teach others, discipline others, correct others, because the deepest form of programming is when the victim becomes the administrator. You see now? This wasn't about curing the broken. It was about creating the controllable. Let's rip the veil wide open now. By the time most of the town began to question the Ashfords, it was already too late. Because the real genius of their system wasn't just what happened inside the convent. It was what happened after. Dozens of former patients, once described as defiant, unstable, even violent, returned home perfectly changed. Too perfectly. They didn't just behave, they conformed. Smiling, obedient, hyperlogical. They accepted arranged marriages without protest, took on caretaking roles without hesitation. One woman, Clara Winslow, who tried to run away from her father 3 times, returned and asked to take his surname again, even after he'd beaten her into unconsciousness just a year prior. You call that recovery? No, that's programming. These women weren't healed. They were converted into mirrors of expectation. And their families, they never asked questions, because the product was exactly what they wanted: peace, control, a daughter who didn't talk back, a wife who never disobeyed, a sister who smiled and served tea while staring straight through you like you were made of fog. But every system leaves traces. The journals of Dr. Samuel Hartwell, recovered from a flooded root cellar 80 years after his death, contain diagrams, not of anatomy, of intervals. He was tracking time between sessions, calculating thresholds, writing phrases like compliance solidifies after 22 days, or language regression more pronounced with sensory deprivation on day 13. It was a formula, not prayer, not discipline, reconstruction, the mind as machinery. And now you begin to understand what Elias brought them. Not just ancient rituals, but the timing of psychological collapse, the stages, the intervals between identity deconstruction and imprinting. And this is where the walls between then and now begin to crack. Because the same intervals reappear in classified CIA documents from MKUltra, in trauma-based conditioning used in black site interrogation, even in rehabilitative models at modern behavior modification centers. 22 days, 13 days, the same milestones, same ghosts. And what of the Ashfords? Agatha's signature disappears from all regional ledgers after 1821. No burial, no obituaries, just gone. Prudence becomes a midwife in New Orleans under a false name. Her notebooks are later seized by the Office of Naval Intelligence in 1946 and locked away. And Temperance? She marries into a family you know very well. Their names still on skyscrapers. We'll get to them. But first, it's time to go deeper into the doctrine. You're starting to see it, aren't you? The pattern, the design, the quiet threads sewn through centuries of correctional care, reform schools, psychiatric advancement. All of it rooted in the same ancient impulse. Control the mind and you control the world. The Ashfords didn't invent this, they inherited it. But what they did with it? They built a system so covert, so refined, that even its victims would defend it. Because that's the final evolution of domination. Not fear, loyalty. In 1818, something changed. A new figure arrived at the convent, one never mentioned in official parish records or town registers. He called himself Father Elias Marrow, but his accent was not English, nor American. Witnesses described him as tall, thin, dressed not in clerical black, but in a gray robe embroidered with symbols no one recognized. Coiled serpents, inverted flames, a broken crown over a silent eye. He stayed in the East Tower, alone, never left during daylight, and yet the sisters deferred to him, even Mother Agatha. Locals only saw him once, during a funeral procession for a patient who'd allegedly died of spiritual rupture, a made-up diagnosis. Witnesses say Elias did not speak a word. He simply walked behind the coffin with his hands folded in a gesture that predated Christianity by millennia, the pose of the hidden flame. It's found in Mesopotamian statues of Enki, Egyptian temple carvings of Thoth, and once, in a Sumerian clay tablet warning of those who rewrite men beneath the skin. Who was Elias? According to a coded letter recovered in 1932 from the ruins of a destroyed Anglican chapel in Essex, Elias Marrow was one of the last keepers of the Root Cipher, an ancient guild of mind forgers believed to have operated within proto-Christian Gnostic circles. They believed the human psyche was a vessel, not a soul, and that with the right rituals, stimuli, and removal of memory, it could be emptied and rewritten. That's what he taught the Ashfords, not how to heal, how to hollow. And after Elias arrived, the experiments intensified. Survivors stopped speaking entirely. They didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't even blink when touched. They had been remade, not rehabilitated, repurposed. What you're hearing isn't just a family's history. It's the origin story of every institution that's ever told you, we know what's best for your mind. They don't want to fix you. They want to format you. History isn't written by the victors. That's a lie they tell children. History is written by those who erase the opposition so thoroughly, no one even remembers there was a war. The Ashfords didn't just erase women, they erased memory. What they perfected in Millbridge would become the invisible architecture of modern behavioral control. And you've seen it, felt it, without ever knowing its name. By the winter of 1815, the convent's focus began to shift. Unofficially, of course, on the surface, the Ashford women continued their healing practices. But beneath the stone floor, in the lightless corridors humming with strange devices, something changed. They began accepting male patients. Not many, just a few, quietly, always under exceptional circumstances. A wayward son of a Boston banker rumored to have attacked his tutor. A young merchant who spoke in tongues after returning from a failed trade expedition to Haiti. A legislator's apprentice who'd begun claiming that voices from the walls were feeding him blueprints to dismantle the republic. Men society labeled unstable, mad, broken. But were they? That's the question no one dares ask. Because none of those men returned. Not as themselves anyway. One came back to Boston with perfect manners, a measured voice, and an unrecognizable signature. He married his late brother's widow, joined the local city council, and pushed through 3 laws related to property seizure and debtor imprisonment. He claimed it was to ensure moral accountability, but those laws just happened to benefit families connected to the Ashfords. Another man disappeared completely. His family was told he succumbed to fever dreams and spiritual corruption. No grave was provided, just a sealed vial of blackened ash and a note quoting scripture. But the verse wasn't from the Bible. It was from the Book of Enoch, banned centuries ago. They weren't just experimenting on individuals anymore. They were building templates. If they could restructure the mind of a disobedient woman, could they engineer the perfect functionary? A man stripped of inner chaos, fully programmable, loyal to the idea of order, not conscience. This was no longer about moral correction. This was the beginning of operational psychotechnology, and it was decades ahead of what later institutions like the Tavistock Clinic, MK Ultra, or Project Monarch would even dream of. The Ashfords weren't following a trend. They were the origin. And the world you live in now, it still follows their blueprints. By 1812, the Ashford Convent had become more than a whispered solution for unruly women. It was an institution of reputation, shrouded in prestige and secrecy. Families with influence began sending their daughters from as far away as New York and Philadelphia, under the pretense of moral refinement. But the truth was far darker. These were not young women needing guidance. They were heirs, thinkers, protesters, rebels. Women who asked too many questions. Women who wouldn't marry the right man, or who knew too much about their family's business. Some were merely inconvenient. Others, threats to the bloodline's reputation. And so they were sent to the Ashfords, not to be healed, but to be dismantled. That's when the disappearances began. You won't find them in any police record, because there were no police yet. Just community watchmen, men who'd been paid handsomely in gold, gifted smoked meats, fine whiskey, and absolution from their own sins, all for their silence. Over the next 5 years, 31 women were discharged from the convent. None ever returned home. Their families received sealed letters, not from the sisters, but from notaries. Your daughter has chosen a cloistered life of permanent prayer. She wishes no further contact. The handwriting never matched the girl's known pen, but the wax seal, always the same, an ash tree with a coiled serpent around its roots. A symbol not found in any Anglican archive. That seal, later uncovered in the Vatican's suppressed reliquary of heretical orders, wasn't Christian, it was pre-Christian, Druidic, pagan, representing transformation through suffering, death of the ego, rebirth through ritual. The Ashfords had lied from the beginning. They were not Anglican nuns. They weren't even fully aligned with the Church of England. Their methods echoed something older, a fusion of esoteric anatomy, occult ritual, and behavioral conditioning practiced by hidden sects long before Christianity seized Europe's spiritual narrative. They weren't here to save souls. They were here to reprogram them. What's worse, they didn't work alone. Evidence from a recently declassified 1854 Freemasonic ledger, blacked out in places and almost lost to mold, mentions the Convent of Eternal Tears by name. It refers to it not as a threat, but as a model, a promising node for higher work. One line stood out above all. Their methods proved successful. Phase 2 must consider the male mind. And just like that, the experiment expanded. Are you ready to keep going? Because from here on out, we go deeper. You've been taught that madness is a malfunction, a misfire in the brain, a chemical imbalance. But what if madness is manufactured? The Ashford sisters didn't simply treat mental illness. They designed it, engineered it, used it as a tool, a scalpel to carve away free will. Their methods weren't born of religious compassion, but of centuries-old psychological warfare passed down through shadow institutions masquerading as benevolent orders. What Thomas Brewster saw in that basement wasn't an aberration. It was a ritual, a calibration. You think they were trying to heal that woman? No. They were overwriting her. And not just her. Hundreds. They called it spiritual reformation. A noble lie. What it really meant was cognitive obliteration, a process designed to strip women of autonomy and rebuild them as compliant vessels. They weren't purging demons, they were severing identities, resetting behavior, one incision at a time. The surgical instruments? Imported, custom-made. Temperance Ashford didn't just assist, she innovated. Her sketches, later found in the hidden compartment of a decaying desk, revealed designs eerily similar to 20th century electroshock devices and frontal lobotomy tools, nearly 150 years ahead of their time. Drawn with clinical precision, annotated in Latin, not for healing, but for control, and it worked. When survivors were released, they were obedient, quiet, their fire gone, their eyes vacant. They never spoke of what happened, not because they didn't remember, but because something had been removed, extracted, something essential. No scars, no bruises, just silence. You need to understand, the Ashford Convent was a prototype, a black site before the concept existed. No barbed wire, no guards, just belief. Belief in reputation, in God, in the shame of being unfit. And behind those beliefs, total freedom for the sisters to experiment. Dr. Hartwell, the circuit physician, knew. He wrote in his private ledger, "This is not science. This is crafting souls in the furnace of obedience. I fear they will not stop at women." He was right, because what began with women expanded, slowly, quietly. The tools were refined, the language evolved, and the methods absorbed by institutions you still trust. What if the mad weren't broken at all, but made to appear broken? What if obedience is the true outcome? And what if these methods never disappeared? They didn't. They just changed their names. They were never supposed to be remembered. Not by name, not by face, not by what they did beneath the stone floors while the world prayed above. And yet, here you are, listening. There's a reason this story never made it into textbooks. Not because it was too unbelievable, but because it was too real. The Ashford name doesn't echo through halls of power or shimmer across oil paintings in grand estates. And yet, they were some of the most dangerous architects of control the New World ever imported. Hidden behind the mask of sanctity, wrapped in the robes of spiritual salvation, their weapon was not faith, it was obedience, not healing, but erasure. You'll soon understand. The Convent of Eternal Tears, even the name feels like something you weren't meant to say out loud. Tucked into the snow-choked wilderness of Maine, its stone walls bore witness to acts so precise, so utterly devoid of compassion, that not even the most merciless institutions of the time could rival it. And still, people paid. They paid gladly, because the Ashfords offered something no doctor, preacher, or governor could, the promise of perfect silence for inconvenient women. But this story isn't just about what was done to them. It's about what they unlocked. It's about the methods passed down in whispers across oceans, through medical guilds and secret religious orders. It's about what happens when the mind becomes property and identity is something that can be extracted, rewired, replaced. You see, the Ashford sisters didn't come to America for refuge. They came for freedom. Not spiritual freedom, operational freedom. In Europe, their work was watched, limited, bound by the feigned ethics of old institutions. But here, in the chaos of a young republic, they found the perfect vacuum of oversight. And into that void, they poured something far more dangerous than witchcraft or superstition. They poured knowledge. Forbidden, ancient, weaponized knowledge. The kind once reserved for inquisitors and executioners. The kind designed not to punish the body, but to reformat the soul. What you're about to hear, you will not unhear. And after today, you'll never look at authority, religion, or mental health the same way again. The descent begins now. Now we leave the mirror room behind and enter the shadows where real resistance is born. Because here's what the Ashfords never counted on. That men would find each other, not in churches, not in politics, but in signal space. The quiet digital corners where truth is whispered like contraband. That's where you are now. This isn't a YouTube video, this is a transmission. And if you've made it this far, it means you're more than curious. You're coded. You're one of us. Men who were never meant to kneel. Let me tell you something buried in the ruins of the Convent of Eternal Tears. Among the ash and collapsed stone, they found a floor tile, different from the rest. Charred, but intact. Inscribed in Latin, non solus in tenebris, fratres sumus in umbra. Not alone in darkness, brothers we are in the shadow. This wasn't just a cult. It was a prototype of containment technology meant to keep the opposite kind of knowledge locked away. Knowledge of sovereign networks, small groups of awakened men working in silence outside the system. And those networks still exist. You'll never see them trending. You won't find their discords or Reddits, but you'll feel them. In the stranger who nods when you say something true, in the creator who dares say what no one else will, in the friend who looks you in the eye and doesn't flinch. We call them signal brothers. They don't wear uniforms. They don't need leaders. They share a compass. Truth over comfort. Structure without submission. Brotherhood without dependency. Action without applause. Every empire fears this kind of man because he cannot be bought, and when he finds another, he cannot be stopped. So I'll ask you now, in the open, but coded, drop the phrase in the comments again. Brothers in the shadow, signal received. Let them see, let the algorithm notice, let the sleepers wonder. Because we're not hiding anymore. Now we build the blueprint, because rage without direction is still control. Awakening without action is just another form of sedation. The Ashfords counted on your pain, they even engineered it, but they also counted on your passivity. They knew that most men, even after waking up, would do nothing. But not you. So let's begin phase 1. Extraction, not from a place, from a pattern. And the first weapon in your arsenal? Sovereign choice. Not reaction, not compliance, not rebellion. Choice. Understand this. The system doesn't care if you conform or resist. It only cares that you stay within the script. Obedience and outrage are both predictable, but sovereignty? That's dangerous. Let me show you how it works with 3 silent detonations that destroy the Ashford echo from within. 1. Speak when silence is expected. At work, at the table, in the mirror. When they say, don't rock the boat, tip the damn boat, because silence is the glue of false realities. Break it, and you break their spell. 2. Refuse unearned guilt. The Ashford doctrine thrives on making you feel wrong for simply existing. Every time you feel guilt for telling the truth, for wanting more, for being male, stop. Ask whose voice is that in my head, and if it's not yours, delete it. 3. Reclaim your inputs. Your feed is your battlefield. Curate it like your survival depends on it, because it does. Every meme, every podcast, every piece of content you consume is a vote for the world you live in tomorrow. Stop feeding the ghost that's haunting your lineage. And if you need a single action to anchor your sovereignty tonight, write your own doctrine. 1 page, handwritten, not typed. No rules, just truths you know before the world taught you otherwise. Burn it into your bones, because that page is more sacred than any book the Ashfords ever forged, more dangerous than any dagger, more enduring than any inheritance. That page is your anchor in the storm to come. In Section 19, we begin building the resistance network, the encoded brotherhood that has existed in every empire's shadow. But for now, ask yourself, what will I choose when no one is watching? That answer is your new identity.